My name's Richard Craik. The name of this talk is Living with Autism. That doodly-doo is a link to my portfolio website, so feel free to jot it down on there as links to things like LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, or as my dad calls it, FaceTube, and goodness knows what else, so feel free to network. And as already mentioned, I've got business cards here as well, so should want to network afterwards, ask questions or professionally network, whatever you can. So the idea of me doing these kind of talks originated about 12 years ago when I was in the kind of mainstream, below year 11 education. This was pre, you could leave at 16 before the 18 cap came in. And I had some interesting experiences in education in regards of support and so on for autism. And I would say people who are deemed as professionals coming in and telling me who I was, and also the literature at the time was very doom and gloom, and reading it, and going, your child is autistic, they're doomed, they're going to be dependent on the welfare state, they're never going to amount to much, have a nice day, which wasn't overly enthusiastic to, somebody about to sit their GCSEs. So that's why I started to do what I did, because I thought, what do these experts know other than years and years of education? I live it, I know what I'm talking about. So my idea is kind of a light-hearted, humorous way of doing things. So, the first exercise, I'd like your input a bit, only if you're comfortable, that is. I mainly do this exercise when I give similar talks to school students, but I find it's also very effective with all age groups. And that is why autism and Asperger Syndrome and conditions like it are known as the hidden disabilities. So, you bring up the standard clip art of a group of people, and then I'll say to the students, okay, point out the person with a disability. And of course the conventional answer is, well, none of them, mate. Well, why'd you say that? Why do you think the students think that? There you go. Society dictates that means disability. And what does that represent? Thank you, wheelchair user. You have to be able to see it. If I'm crutches and a leg brace, you can see that I've broken or done something to my leg. For the most part, I like to think if people see me, they think, well, he's had a few too many beers, but other than that, he seems perfectly all right. And that's the icebreaker I like to put in with students and others, is to kind of say, just because the disability isn't visual doesn't mean it's not there, if that makes sense. And that kind of activity could be used, I don't know if with other students and so on, and also with adults and others, because there's still a lot of misconception, as was mentioned in the talk before, about with there being no visual prompt representation, people aren't really quite sure what it is they're meant to understand. So, the autistic spectrum, otherwise known as ASC, Autism Spectrum Condition, is a range of conditions umbrellaed into what's called Autism Spectrum Condition. So Asperger Syndrome, autism, and a few others are under this umbrella term, if you will. Now, being it's a spectrum, this is where it makes things slightly difficult for anyone supporting someone with autism. The spectrum means that you'll have a textbook definition of what autism is, but then you'll come across two students who both have autism but are very different. So you'll get some people with autism who struggle to speak, and then you get buggers like me who never shut up. Now, again, no two people are the same on the spectrum, as I've mentioned. Well, I've already said about that. One may be able to talk a lot, one may not be. And when I speak to students, I say it goes back to that age-old lesson we learn in primary school or lower school, in that we're all different. Whether it's our interests, our beliefs, things of that nature. Now, I'm trying to be careful to use the term autism spectrum condition rather than the default. I was diagnosed with Asperger Syndrome, which is classed as high functioning autism. But that's all changed recently in the US. They've scrapped the Asperger Syndrome word and have put it all into what's called Autism Spectrum condition. Now, the reason I bring this up is that whatever happens to the diagnostic definitions in America tend to be a matter of time before they're implemented in Europe, and I know a lot more diagnoses now aren't coming out as specific autism or specific Asperger's, they're coming out as autism spectrum condition. So something to keep in mind, although those other words will still be around for a long time. So, with that being said, how does autism affect people? Because we've now covered the bits about terminology. So, I like to use this graphic because the first thing that autism primarily affects is the most important part of the human body, the brain. And that is that, are people here familiar with what MRI brain scans are? They image the brain, they'll get the person under the imager to think of something, and an area of the brain will light up to show the activity. They found that people with autism's brains map differently than those without autism. So this leads to people with autism having tremendous strengths, but also, in cases, very debilitating weaknesses, which I'll cover in a moment. Now, this ultimately affects how the brain perceives information. So if you compare someone with autism compared to, the term's not normal, the term's neurotypical, compared to a neurotypical brain, the way things like sensory perception are interpreted are very different. Again, I'll come to that in a moment. So, going on to the senses. So obviously you've got your 5 senses. Whoops. Oh, there we go. Sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell. So I want to try and give some examples of what could be the case. I want to make it clear that, again, the idea of the spectrum is that not everyone on the spectrum will be affected by everything I'm going to mention. Some may have 1 or 2, some may have none. So, first one is sight. Light perception can be to a point where someone with autism may need to wear sunglasses nearly at all times because the fluorescent lights are blinding them. Going on to auditory. Now, I'll get back to that in a minute, but well timed. So the idea of sunglasses, some of my friends with autism used to have specially coated lenses for glasses so that they could read information on paper more easily. I know that co-acts with another diagnosis condition, but some who weren't diagnosed that found that easier in order to read and interpret data. Sight can also be that those affected may be able to see patterns in things that others just simply can't, have a great eye for detail. But another thing a lot of people don't think about, in our business world, I've moved the chair away and I'm going to bring it back. So I want to give an example. So everyone knows the idea of being interviewed for a job. You know, so I'm being sat here, you're interviewing me. I'm going to sit upright, good posture, give you eye contact. Now what if I told you some people with autism not choose to not give contact, but physically can't give eye contact because the notions can trigger warnings in the brain to say you're under threat, similar to the fight or flight technique. The fight or flight instincts found in primitive caveman mankind. I personally don't have this problem, but I have read testimonies where people have described being forced to give eye contact and it being the same sensation they get when having chlorine in their eyes from swimming. Not pleasant. So, something to consider. Hearing, as we heard from a gentleman before. They may have very acute hearing. The notion of hearing a needle drop, they might be very well able to do that. You might find that some people with autism struggle to pick up certain frequencies of audio, but yet if you put them in the hearing test, go through that diagnosis to see if they have any hearing impairment, nothing will come up. Also with hearing is also the ability to perceive and filter information. So I'll try another example. So just trying to think how I'm going to do this. So I need a volunteer from the audience. Okay, super. I was going to say, you don't have to stand up, but what I'm going to say is, what I want you to imagine is I'm talking to you about this presentation. Now I want you to imagine that this gentleman here is talking to this lady here about the great holiday I had last week in Barbados. These guys back here are talking about how brilliantly England are doing the World Cup, or not, I don't know, I don't follow football. This table here are talking about, I'm trying to not delve towards something political. They're talking about gardening. There we go. I've saved it. And this group here are talking about mental health provision. Now, the idea of some people with autism, and I get this quite a lot, is that you fail to filter out all the noise in the background. So, if I were in your shoes, all of a sudden I'm talking about autism in Barbados in conjunction with the World Cup, whilst gardening in mental health. And you think, what the bloody hell are they all talking about? It's all nonsense, it's gobbledygook. Which can be why people with autism get very frustrated, because they're thinking, I'm paying attention to you, but you're not making any sense. So, the next is taste. Now, this one's quite tricky because mainly in youngsters with autism, this is defined as, oh, they're picky eaters. They're just being stubborn. They're just being awkward. We'll just get them to eat whatever it is time and time again until they like it, or if they don't like it, then so be it. We've made them, I don't know, try cabbage 10 times, or bacon, or broccoli, or potatoes, or whatever it is. Similar to, and not maybe to the same extent, but there was the piece just in the talk before about the mental health with the food or drink being detected as poison. Do you remember that? Yeah. Similar kind of thing here, where with things like taste, certain tastes will trigger a completely random and non-logical response from the brain, where the brain will say, whatever is in your mouth, get it out, get it out. And if you congest it, there's only one way the body's going to get it out of your system. I won't start because we've just had lunch, but you get the idea. So the idea that these youngsters in particular, as I say, are being told, oh, you're just a fussy eater, you will learn to love spinach, or you will learn to love chocolate, or whatever it is, it's very difficult because it's their brain, it's their whole entity, unbeknownst to them, saying, whatever it is you're ingesting, don't do it. Touch. This can be anything from material of clothing. So I remember there was a young lad in our school who constantly got into trouble with the school because he never wore his school uniform properly. But that's because the particular not blazer, it was like a fleece or something of that nature, caused him to itch incessantly. There was no allergic reaction. They had the tests, nothing in that nature. His brain was making him sorry, I'm not wording myself very well here. Basically, the feeling of that fabric against his skin, his brain was interpreting very negatively, and as a consequence, he'd keep getting in trouble despite doctors and others going in and saying, well, this is what's going on. Touch can also be the kind of reassuring. I'm sure we're all familiar with this. If someone's having a hard time, you might pat on the back, say, oh, you're all right, mate, or pat on the shoulder and say, well done, you did really, really well there. Things like that could, and I use the word could because again, not everyone's the same with autism, could make them jump out their skin and go, no, don't like that. Another contact, such as maybe the friendly hug, you haven't seen them for years and stuff. With things like that, it's always best to ask permission. Am I okay to give you a hug, or something along those lines. And then with smell, again, with autistic people, you may have some who have a very overpowering sense of smell to a point where they may come in here and smell every single individual brand of Lynx or, I don't know, Eau de Toilette or Chanel or I don't know, whatever brands these things are, but be able to detect every single one and find it so overpowering they can't physically be in here. In other cases, some may have a very poor sense of smell. An example, when I used to be a mental health worker, we had to work very particularly with very hard with a particular young person with autism because they couldn't smell gas, which, as you can imagine, may be slightly problematic. So this all goes back to how the sensory input leads to the brain and how the brain interprets that information. Oh, before I do go on, I at the very end I'm doing like a Q&A thingamabob, so if I'm talking a load of nonsense you can quiz me on that after. I'm not clumsy, I swear. So, next, I mentioned about strengths and weaknesses. So, autism can affect hobbies and interests, making them things like fascinations. So, again, stereotypically with youngsters with autism, you'll get them become experts on their craft. And to hone them to these interests and hobbies is quite crucial. Granted, one of my special interests is Star Wars. I don't see if I'm going to get a job being an architect for a Death Star anytime soon. However, you never know. But the idea being that these students have the potential, these people have potential to become the next great scientist, they have the potential to become the next great veterinarian, they have the possibility to do boundless things with the right support. So, going back to the idea of the brain's perceptions of things, the interests and hobbies, that's a bonus, that's a fascination, that's something where, once harnessed, can lead to great opportunities. But the flip side is there will be some things that they can't interpret, there'll be things that they really struggle with, there'll be things that they'll see their peers doing, whether that's a sport or a particular subject in school, and they think, well, you know, I'm studying just as hard, I'm doing this, and they're just not getting it. And it'll be something to do with somewhere up in there, I describe it somewhat as a bit of an invisible barrier. I can't really describe it as much else because you can see the way forward, but for whatever reason, bam, something's just keeping you in place. So, oh, there we go. So, interacting socially. This is, I think, where a lot of media archetypes come from with autism. We're all a bit weird, we're all a bit socially quirky, we're all the kind of Sheldon Cooper types from The Big Bang Theory or Rain Man or what have you. So, coming from an education standpoint, an autistic person may not perform well in groups. You know, they may not understand the social etiquette behind groups. You know, there may be an assigned group leader, but the autistic person says, this person's full of it, I've got a better idea, or they may fall out of line and go and do their own thing. I've already mentioned this regarding nonverbal behavior, so the body posturing, the eye contact, things of that which is ingrained in us from a young age. You know, if you want to make a good impression in an interview, sit up straight, give eye contact, use your social cues, your pleasantries, your hello sir, hello ma'am, that kind of etiquette. But if you struggle to perform those, where are you going to stand? Misunderstanding of common phrases. Now, I'm sure we've all heard the phrase, it's raining cats and dogs. If you're going to say that to someone with autism who particularly loves animals, don't, because it may end in problems. Misunderstand sarcasm. Now, I could have put up a clip here of, has anyone here seen clips of Big Bang Theory or anything? There's a famous scene with the character Sheldon Cooper completely misunderstands sarcasm, and the other characters make from the sarcasm sign, so that when there's a social interaction going on, they can stand behind the person talking to them and hold up sarcasm, so he knows, oh, they're being sarcastic, they're not actually asking me this particular question. And things with people with autism, tend to be black and white. In a world that's covered in many shades of grey, it's right or wrong. It's left or it's right. It's 1 or a 0. There's no grey area. If it says the meeting's starting at 10 o'clock, it's starting at 10 o'clock. If the class is going to be in here, Foster Building, it's going to be in Foster Building. If the meeting, Brad's going to be the leader, then Brad's the leader. We're not changing the leader. That's not part of the plan. Excuse me. So, I mentioned a little bit there about kind of a plan, a routine. That is because people with autism find comfort in a routine. It gives them some form of structure, stability, some form of reassurance in a chaotic world full of many shades of grey. Now, this can be from planning your day out. So, I don't know, 8 o'clock I wake up, 9 o'clock I'm out to work, 5 o'clock I come home, watch telly, 6 o'clock have my tea, 10 o'clock go to bed. Or it could be as pedantic as 8 o'clock wake up, 8:02 get out of bed, 8:04 brush my teeth. You get the idea. Now if this all changes, people with autism tend not to do well with change, so there's always going to be things out of our control. Anyone heard of Northern Rail recently? There's always going to be things that aren't within our purview to control. But when stuff like that happens, it can be as minor as stamp your feet, get a bit, that's annoying. Or in the case of someone with autism, it can be essentially, to them, the end of the world. But I'll come into that kind of reactionary later on in my presentation. Now, the first of these kind of reactionary, so, sorry, who was it who was presenting just before me? Are they still here or have they gone?
No, they're gone.
Right, okay, well the water experiment was actually very apt. I have a similar analogy. So here's a bottle of Coke. Be aware other fizzy drinks are available. And this is empty because I've drunk it, because, yeah. But imagine this is full of your fizzy cola. Now, that's with all your sensory stuff. You know, you're trying to work a regular job. You've got all the sensory stuff on top of the stress of your normal job. Now your boss says you've got to have a meeting but you didn't prepare for. Okay, no, okay, everything's going on, but I'm gonna get there. And then now the bottle's shaking. Now all the fizzy stuff's starting to build up. And I'm sure we all know what happens if you shake a fizzy bottle long enough. This is reaction 1, called a meltdown. Why do I keep knocking into this? Dyspraxic, sorry. So, what is a meltdown? Now, a meltdown can be a reaction when the brain perceives too much information. There's physically too much going on. They can't filter out the information, whether that's the World Cup gardening mental health, or whether that's the blinding light combined with the smell of somebody's perfume that's very pertinent, things of that nature that neurotypicals can filter out. Now, with a meltdown, this can come across as verbal or physical barrage. So, I've got quite a lot of friends with autism. Could be, there's the chair, smash. It could be a verbal barrage that would make Malcolm Tucker blush. It could be anything of that nature, which to the person on the receiving end, which, you know, maybe you guys, maybe people you tutor, can be bloody scary. Now, okay, I'm going to try and give an example. So let's say I've had a meltdown here, everything's gone wrong, I've chucked a chair, I've entered that kind of rage mode. By the end of it, I'm here, I'm thinking, oh God, I'm feeling physically drained, mentally exhausted, I'm guilty, I'm ashamed, scared, and powerless. What this cannot be interpreted as is what a lot of people interpret them as a temper tantrum. Now I've got a picture of the Incredible Hulk from the Marvel movies, because that's what it can come across as, a completely random kind of reaction. But something that must be clear is that it's not a tantrum, it's a way, I think it was described in the other presentation quite well in relation to self-harm. It's a way of dealing with those kind of stressful emotions. This is a similar concept. So, whilst obviously meltdowns aren't pleasant for the individual who's having it and can be scary and be intimidating for the person who's, you know, receiving it and potentially dangerous, be aware that, as I say, it's not a tantrum, but also that it's not an unnatural reaction. Again, that will sound scary, but I'm just trying to lay this home because, again, they can seem to come out of nowhere, but again, with this analogy, things are building up, and goes everywhere. So this is one of the two kind of major reactions. So the second one is somewhat of a polar opposite. It's called a shutdown. Now this is where, so I'd say a meltdown is an extroverted response. You're pushing out the stress, the grief, the complete lack of confusion and logical thought onto everything around you, whether it be a chair or whether it be a person, whether it be through physical or whether it be through verbal intent. A shutdown is the opposite. This is what I'd call kind of an introvert. This is an implosion rather than an explosion. And that's where, again, the brain receives too much information. And this is where the person experiencing the shutdown will begin to experience very negative, inward thinking thoughts. Now, shutdowns can be very bloody hard to detect, because if you've got someone on the spectrum who barely talks on a good day, how are you going to notice that they're not going to talk to you when they're having a shutdown? And this can be a pathway to other conditions such as clinical depression and so on. So, yeah, so I can't really think of much else to top off on that one, but you get the idea, I hope. So I do this section called myth busting because over the years I've had numerous questions from numerous people, you know, ranging from parents to tutors to teachers to nurses, etc., etc. And so I've picked out a few myth busting ones. So the first one is, do vaccines cause autism? Because I was diagnosed in the mid-90s, around the time everyone was going a bit hoo-ha that the MMR vaccine caused autism, and everyone was scared about making their children geniuses, I think. No, but they were, you know, it was a genuine concern because at the time the media were peddling it. Now, from what I understand from speaking to friends who do various science degrees, etc., is that particular research was I think the clinical term is BS, and there is no scientific correlation, although there is still the misconception out there. Now, the misconception isn't helped when idiots like this come out and say autism rates through the roof. Why doesn't the Obama administration do something about the doctor-inflicted autism? We lose nothing to try. Thank God he's not in any position of power. Oh wait, but you get the idea. But I'm not doing this to have a go at those who think that, because again, at the time, it was everywhere. You know, I went back and, you know, looked at archived newspapers and so on, and old news reports and so on. You know, you'd be a bit mad to not to second guess at the time, if that makes sense. So the next one is, can I catch it? So after one of my first ever talks to a student group, some student put up their hand and they said, all right, I gotta ask, or I gotta ask, can I like catch it or something? So I had to explain that no, autism doesn't catch through sneezing or coughing or, I don't know, sweating or whatever. The theory, as I understand it at the moment, is that it's passed down genetically, hereditary through families. I still think they're kind of trying to figure that one out. You know, I look at my own family and I'm like, yep, autistic, 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 but you know, you ask them, no, of course not. Don't be absurd, but you get the idea. The other idea is that well, and this is a very kind of way out there kind of conspiracy theory one, but the idea that it's going to be the next kind of version of Homo sapien evolution, but take that as you will. This one's very important to me, and that is the idea that people with autism feel no empathy, there's no emotion, there's no sense of identity. We're all these kind of Doctor Who Cybermen or Daleks, or these mindless, emotionless tin robots. Again, I think the clinical definition for that remark is BS. There was a piece in a book I read called Autistics on Mental Health, who summed up brilliantly, and they said that with all the information we receive from the senses and all this other stuff, and trying to figure out how social cues work and everything, we're over empathetic. We're thinking, how can we help this person? But does this mean if we do this, will it mean that they're not our friend anymore? But are they still our friend? And how can we help this person? And all these things that make us want to be similar to everyone else, and things that make us want to belong with everyone else, makes us very connected to our fellow humans, but it's very hard to articulate it. I think another example is, another idea from a book was that we feel so much, we don't know what feeling to convey. So the safest option is to try and remain a neutral stance, but on the inside they're thinking, oh God, I'm feeling so anxious, but I'm so angry, but I'm so happy. Everything's kind of going on at once, and you're not sure, where do I side with all this going on? So it's all well me coming here and telling you all about autism, but if it only affects 1 in 1 or 2 billion people, there's not really that much point. Well, there is, but you're not going to come across many in your professional career. So points of stats point to about 1 in 100-ish. Some believe it could be as common as 1 in 60 because there's a lot of the misdiagnosed adults who, as kids, were just considered eccentric or a bit weird or a bit socially inept. When I was diagnosed in the 90s, it was 1 in 1,000, so that gives you an idea of how quickly things have changed. But on the flip side of that, there's been a lot of talk of, oh, kids are being diagnosed with everything. In my day, it was just being disruptive or so on, and now everyone's getting ADHD and all that. The concept, or at least my belief, is that we're just becoming far better at diagnosing it. In the same way that I mentioned the MRI brain scan before, they are currently, I believe, as I understand it, doing tests to bring that into diagnostic material, because they've found that there's a 90-something% accuracy of diagnosing autistic people using that method. So that could be a future thing. Now, 3 out of 4 people with autism currently are diagnosed as male, and 1 in 4 are female. This means that some people believe there are more people with autism who are men, period. I'm of the belief that because most research on autism is done with males with autism, but it just hasn't really caught up yet with the women demographic. But there are those kind of 2 viewpoints, if you will. The other viewpoint from people who I've spoken to at autism support groups and so on is that young girls tend to be very good at impersonating or following social cues, maybe not understanding them, but don't convey the same way as boys do at a young age, which provokes an early onset for a diagnosis. Am I making sense so far? Basically, women are a bit brighter than us blokes, sorry. But we already knew that. So, I'm trying to win side here, guys. So, how can we relate to autism? So I've mentioned the stats, and I've mentioned, how our beautiful minds are so different. And they said strange, I'm going to go with different. How can we relate to it? So, first, we're going to look at some famous figures in various different industries. We've got Mr. Gates, former richest man in the world, now head of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, former head of Microsoft, responsible for Microsoft Windows, the Xbox, and is currently using all of his wealth to cure malaria and various other diseases around the world. He's doing all right for himself. Next, Albert Einstein. I'm not going to try and feng shui what I'm going to say because I'm no scientist, but I think everyone knows that Albert Einstein contributed a significant amount to the scientific community. Now, the language I'm going to use is a bit harsh, but I'm using it from the clinical term at the time. When Albert Einstein was a youngster, obviously he wasn't diagnosed with autism or Asperger's, but he was suspected. When he was young, about 2 or 3 years old, psychologists or the equivalent at the time noted that he was socially retarded and wouldn't be able to amalgamate into community. Did all right. So next one is Tim Burton. He he's still alive. He is a famous movie director, known for the recent Alice in Wonderland movies, kind of has a dark kind of turn on movies, and also made Batman cool again. Now, I can never pronounce this gentleman's name. Satoshi, I can't, sorry. Anyway, this gentleman. Anyone have any idea who he is? Okay. Creator of Pokemon. Multi-billion dollar franchise that's still going to this day. I think, well, do it. Unfortunately, no longer with it. Yeah, there's a little Pikachu there, but unfortunately no longer with us, but no doubt he's made an impact. Oh, and my laser's stuck on. Oh dear. Oh. There we go. Sorry, was being a bit silly there. So, next bunch of famous figures. Mark Zuckerberg, youngest billionaire on the planet, owner of Facebook, kind of lost a bit of notoriety recently given the Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, Russia, Brexit, I don't know, shoe controversies, I don't know, but you can't argue that he's made some kind of impact, whatever your stance is on Facebook and social media and what have you. I think they now have 2 billion users, not bad. Next, Garry Newman, famous for tracks like Cars. Really like him, really like his music, kind of a techno-electric kind of beat to it. Recently, I make it sound like he recently came out as autistic. Sorry, just for terminology, as I thought it through my head, I'm like, hang on a minute. But anyway, yeah, and said that it's definitely helped his creative flow when it came to creating music and turned what he loved doing into his career as an artist. And the last, Susan Boyle from, was it Britain's Got Talent? Yeah, Britain's Got Talent. After the show, some people had said, oh, we think you might have autism, went through the diagnostic channels, and then, well, hey, there you go, someone with autism. Going back to that 3 and 4 being male, again, sorry, you know, there's not many women famous figures I could find with autism. Again, I'm still of the opinion that the diagnostic pathway for autism is more attuned towards males and females. So, how else can we relate to autism? So, okay, we've learned how a few rich and famous people have used autism to their advantage somewhat. Films and TV shows. So, you've had a hard day at work, you think, right, I'm going to go home, I don't know, watch some Netflix or DVDs or whatever, or television, if you have time or whatever. So, some examples. Doc Martin. Anyone watch Doc Martin? Okay, yeah. Dr. Asperger, I've heard him being called before. ITV series, quite humorous, and yeah. The Bridge. Has anyone heard of The Bridge? Yeah, is it Scandinavian drama? Yeah. Well, anyway, English subtitles, and the interesting thing is that the lady, main protagonist, protagonist, called Saga, very kind of conventional autism. It's never brought up in the show that she is autistic, but very, very interesting show, dynamic between her and her partner in the police service. I don't want to put any spoilers out there because it's such a good show. Next, The Social Network, the movie of Facebook. So this is back when Facebook had 500 million users, and it's the story of how Mark Zuckerberg created the social media empire. And Jesse Eisenberg, who plays Zuckerberg, got a lot of his nuances on point, and a lot of people then came out and wrote, oh, Zuckerberg must be on the spectrum and what have you from that portrayal. The Fifth Estate, Benedict Cumberbatch plays a gentleman called, oh, what was he called? Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, famous for the leak of intel into the, I think it was the war in Afghanistan or Iraq, and various other leaks from governments around the world. And in the movie, it was discussed that Julian Assange may be autistic, and there's a few nuances in the performance that hint towards it. But either way, very interesting movie. It makes you really think. Next one, which isn't pictured, The A Word, BBC. Premise is that the youngest member of the family, little boy, is just diagnosed autistic, and how do the family respond? The grandparents are very resistant to it, very, oh, if the diagnosis will hold him back, whereas the parents are a bit more understanding, and how do the siblings react, and it raises a lot of good questions. House, which is an American medical drama, the main actor in that's Hugh Laurie, very good show. Think of him as the doctor version of Sherlock. So if you like Sherlock and you like medical, that's a good show for you. Okay. Next, books. So here are some books I'd recommend. First one is House Rules by, and I can't pronounce the author's name, Jodie Picoult. Anyway, House Rules, a quick idea of a blurb. Young boy with autism is suspected of murder. Now, obviously the family, very concerned. And when they get down to things like the questioning by the police and the trial, well, you see, Your Honour, when we questioned him, he didn't give us eye contact. He slouched, he fidgeted. He's obviously guilty. Or is he? Could that be a guilty conscience? Or could that be his autistic tendencies? That's all I'll say. Lives of Autism by Dr. Steve Mee. In which every chapter of the book is written by an autistic person on life experiences. I do a piece in there about the world of work with autism, and several of my friends do have written chapters on family life, relationships, and various other aspects of life. Next, All Cats Have Asperger's. This is one of my favourites. Now this, do you remember I mentioned earlier about the doom and gloom texts of, when I was a little kid, and yeah, your child's going to become nothing, yada, yada, yada. This just blows that completely out of the water. It's by Kathy Hoopman. And what it is, it's a giant picture book with a picture of a cat on every page with a little sentence that describes autistic characteristics to that of cat behaviour. And because everyone has seen a cat or knows someone who owns a cat, it's a very light-hearted and friendly way to introduce someone to what is autism and what is Asperger Syndrome. For disclaimer, there is a sister book as well which is very good called All Dogs Have ADHD, which, when you think about it, it's obvious. It's by the same author, Kathy Hoopman, Inside Asperger's, looking out, similar concept, but not with just more animals, not just cats. But yeah, if you can get hold of, well, especially that one, but either of those two, yes, highly recommend. So, the bit that might be more relevant to you guys, the methods of teaching students with autism, etc. Yeah, I don't know what that means either. So, the first point I would make is, when instructing a student or young person with autism, is be clear with your intent. Again, mentioning about things like sarcasm or misinterpreting phrases, try and be clear and blunt and precise. Next would be try and prepare that individual for a change in the routine. So, like in Miss University, you know, I'll have a class here in Foster Building, and then that morning a little notification will come up on the timetable and say, oh, you've now moved to the other end of campus. And you go, oh goody. So getting that in early to say maybe on the first day, make sure you check your timetable every day, as classrooms may well change or will change or what have you. Maybe a good little thing to at least get it subconsciously in the back of a mind to let them know, so then it's not a big, it's the end of the world, doomsday, DEFCON 10 situation. Now, if you're preparing a complex task like a dissertation, a homework, or a heading, or something, I'm just trying to, I don't know, think of something. Try and break it up into smaller tasks. So you may, I don't know, say I was to give yourself a task and I've just spoken for 5 minutes and I've said everything and you've just gone, what? It's not that you weren't paying attention, it's that you've been so fixated on the first 2 or 3 points, the rest of it's been drowned out from other noise in the background and the sensory aspects we mentioned before. So just try and break it down into smaller, I'd say bite-sized chunks. Next, provide clear rules and expectations. So be clear on what it is you expect from a student, and most of the time, you know, be a little asterisk, small print, most of the time they'll respond well to that because they know exactly what's doing, but also make sure you follow through with that. Are you guys with me so far?
Yeah.
Good. And I think the most important one is the student in question who's autistic, are they presenting challenging behaviour, or are they reacting normally given the parameters of autism? Now, again, we go back to the meltdown, shutdown idea, that it's not a good thing and actions will have to be taken for that, but a bit of understanding to say, you know, we're going to have to sort this out, but everything's all right, can be very reassuring and helpful. Now, I want to give an example of where things don't go so well. And this comes from a good friend, obviously all names and everything are going to be anonymous, where a young lady with autism has a meltdown in a public place. Too much sensory stuff going on in the shopping centre, other stuff's been going on in the background, lashes out in public. They find out that of her diagnosis, etc., and they cart her off to hospital, to a ward, to a bed, essentially sectioning them under the Mental Health Act. So the doctor comes along in the ward and says, "Hi, I'm Dr. So-and-so, now tell me, can you hear voices?" Now, the logical autistic fallacy is to go, well, I'm not deaf, I just heard you speak, so of course I can hear voices, I just heard you ask me the question, so yeah, I hear voices all the time. In fact, I've heard one just now. All of a sudden, all the alarm bells start going off. Now, fast forward, luckily, social worker related to that person came in, diffused the situation just before they were given some very nasty medication that probably would have done some potential damage. But hopefully that highlights where a situation has the potential to go very, very wrong.